Okay, so many of the Mefarshim ask why exactly why exactly we had to go to Mitzrayim, which obviously was predicted was prophesied and committed to by God in the Brit Bein HaBetzarim. But Al-Hazara put a nice little thing together, which I think is important to realize, which is that there's really there's the general philosophical question, which is why did we have to go to Galut? But then what you find later is that the Mefarshim, who themselves lived in Galut, thought that the answer to that question wouldn't just explain textually why we were in Mitzrayim, but could provide insight for why they were in Galut, right? For the way that they suffered in Galut, and they would derive insights from that into their life, and vice versa, right? Things they saw in their life would help them understand, well, maybe what was the point of Galut Mitzrayim. This is essentially, as they point out, part of the theological move of the Haggadah, of B'chol Dor Vador, Omdim Aleinu L'Chalotenu. Right? The fact that we, in the Haggadah, when we're telling the story, we say that whatever it was, V'hi She'amda, right, presumably the Brit, but whatever it was, right, whatever saved us in Mitzrayim continues to save us. But that is essentially saying that there's that there's an element of whatever it was about Mitzrayim that was so important that was true in future Galuyot as well, right? And that's a very important dynamic, right, for people to understand that and read their life and Tanakh in conversation. So they organized a few of the Mefarshim who did that, right? Who particularly focused on their own life as part of the way that they read Tanakh, which is, I think, a different angle that we don't always focus on. Now they note that this is not like a new question. The Midrash already asked this, right? Then Chuma says, right? This is not like a new question, but because so much of our history has been in Galut, right? People keep asking it. So they highlight a few. One is the Sforno. The Sforno, who's living in 15th, 16th century Italy, says that if Yaakov's family had remained in Canaan, they would have gradually absorbed the cultures and values of their neighbors. Being exiled to a society which abhorred them and later enslaved them is what enabled them to grow and develop into a nation. Right? Now, right, again, if you think about when people are living politically, right, 15th century, 16th century Italy, so you're talking, after a few expulsions, right, in Spain and Portugal, where some of the Jews, like the Abarbanel, ends up in Italy after that, right, where they were at the height of their power, right, and really members of the court, and the only thing that really, right, cemented their Judaism was the king saying, "You're Jews, get out of here," right? And then Italy, with the nascent democracy, and eventually, not the 15th century, the ghettos there, right? You can see the ways people would see that Galut, or just anti-Semitism in general, right? You can see starting to read that way is a way of maintaining identity. And Rav Hirsch goes as far as saying that ghettos continued to play the role of Goshen, ensuring that Jews remained distinct and did not assimilate. Now, that's a striking statement. It means that something which is viewed as now again, I don't know if they would say it's good as much as they're reading into, right, they're deriving from Mitzrayim something that will comfort them in hard situations. I mean, he didn't have a ghetto, right? I mean, he's in Germany, right? But he knows that there are ghettos that exist in Europe, right? Germany, in his time, is finally moving towards emancipation, and he's seeing the ways in which that is threatening the Jewish identity, right? So Rav Hirsch, right, you can imagine that what's driving him to interpret it this way is that he's living when finally the Jewish community is gaining emancipation and is spending his whole life fighting that the Jews should maintain their identity and fighting with the reformers, right? And he sees that the struggle is less, let's say, in Hungary, right, where Jews are still separate, right? So he can look at it and say, oh, there might be a value in terms of maintaining identity and being separate. The Netziv goes in a similar direction, though he thinks it's not just the separation, but the oppression that can accomplish preventing assimilation, right? And he even goes farther and says that every time the Jews started to assimilate, so God brought about some sort of oppression which maintained their identity. Rav Hirsch further says that it's not only a vehicle for religious growth, but it also provides for societal and interpersonal maturation. Right? He claims that both the Egyptian and later exiles resulted from jealousy and class distinctions. Yaakov's preferential treatment of Yosef and their differences in status between the sons of his primary wives and those of maidservants led to interesting strife. Similar sectarian divisions have plagued Judaism ever since. Anti-Semitism, though, is blind to such divisions and serves as the great equalizer, promoting unity and forging common experiential bonds. Right? The same way that people will say after the Holocaust, right, you can't care too much about whether someone's frum or not because Hitler didn't care. Right? That type of argument. Right? Or people will say, why don't you recognize fraternal Jews? As Jews, Hitler didn't care. Right? You see that same side of dialogue. We don't even, right, sort of realize it, but that's what we do, right, is the way we're viewed by the outsiders, right, highlight our own identity and create a certain forced unity. And then Rav Elazar Ashkenazi in Poland in the 16th century, and Rav Hirsch says this elsewhere, argue that one of the purposes of Galut is to spread monotheism throughout the world because it forces us to be in contact with others. Now, the question of how compelling these are is an interesting question, right? I don't know, I think a lot of people would be uncomfortable saying, aha, there is anti-Semitism, right, so that we don't assimilate. Or, oh, anti-Semitism is great because it, right, or people who will say, America is the worst because they're nice to us. And, oh, thank God that, there's starting to be anti-Semitism, which right, you hear people say this, which is, oh, thank God there's now starting to be anti-Semitism in America because now people remember they should never get too comfortable, right? Like, I'm not sure that I'm thrilled with that theological move. So I don't go through these Mefarshim. This is why I wanted to discuss it. I don't go through these Mefarshim to say they're definitely right? I think that there's a lot of problems, Dafka, with saying, look, my Rebbeim, both Lechem and Ramital were very much of the opinion that we should not be playing, right, God's interpreter in this world with that prophecy to say, aha, you suffered in this way because of this sin, right? So I do find it difficult to do that. But I'll say this. I think these Mefarshim are helpful in the sense that what they all believe is that whatever Mitzrayim was, every part of it, the good and the bad, are supposed to be models for how we experience life afterwards. That basic insight is true, that both the good and the bad, that as we're suffering, whatever way we're suffering, especially in Galut, right, that we should be gaining insights from Mitzrayim. And the way we react should be inspired in certain ways by what we learned from Mitzrayim. I think that has to be true. Right? Meaning, I think the fact that Tanakh so many times invokes Mitzrayim as what's supposed to sensitize us and what's supposed to, right, be mechayev us and mitzvot, right? The fact that it's that central, I think we can't, right, they have to be right at some level that it provides insight. I would stop short of drawing firm conclusions, right, and saying anti-Semitism is happening because of this, right? Expulsions are happening because of this. But the somewhat attenuated version, which is suffering or oppression can sometimes, even when it's bad, accomplish certain things or remind us that Jews are all united and our differences are not as great as our similarities, or remind us that we are unique, or remind us that there are, right, or, on the positive side, the fact that we're among the other nations should remind us that there are other people in this world that we have to care about, right? That move, the move the Rav makes all the time, which is Jews don't ask why we suffer, but we ask what can we do with the suffering. Right? I'm willing to accept all of these mafarshim on the second level, right, where maybe we shouldn't conclusively say, right, this anti-Semitic attack is happening because X, Y, or Z, right? That's a bit presumptuous. But to say that if Hitler treated all Jews the same, religious or not religious, we should at least commit to being united with all Jews, right? At least derive that. That may not be why it happens, but we should derive it from that, right? Or to say that, right, the fact that the world refuses to recognize, right, the world recognizes that there's such a thing as a Jew, as much as we melt into general society, we should at least derive from that that we have an identity, right? At that level, I think that these Mefarshim have a lot to suggest them, right? And I think it's a very dangerous, right, line to cross, right, from going to what I think these Mefarshim are doing, which is this is why it happens, right, which is dangerous, right, to I'm willing to be, right, have a little bit of epistemic humility, right, and say I don't know why God does what he does, but that doesn't change the fact that if this is how I experience it, right, that I should learn from it. That I think is definitely true. The last point that they note is that in the medieval period, one of the reasons that he thinks some of the Rishonim spend time doing this, and this I think is a very fascinating point, and you see this in Chasei Kreskes and Or Hashem, is that because of the Christian doctrine that the fact that Jews were subjugated was proof that God rejected us, right? There's also a polemical level to all of these interpretations, which is if Christianity viewed our oppression as proof that God rejected us, then that made it more important for Jews to come up with an alternative theology, right? So that may be part of this story also, right? Which is it's not just that they believe that this is why it happened, but that it was necessary for them to come up with a different explanation. So I think it is productive theologically to think in these terms, at least at the level of what can we learn from suffering, right? But to recognize that even if you don't accept the claim that you can definitely know why God did something, to understand why that was a religious sensibility that was important to people who were living in a world where being downtrodden was de facto proof that God had rejected you. Right? It's also important, at least historically, to understand why, for many of the Mefarshim, these types of explanations were really important for their theological outlook on life. So I think it's at least worth having these perspectives in mind as we read the Parshiot of Yetziat Mitzrayim. Okay.